Lubna was 38 years old and had, over the course of her adult life, bought 7 English grammar books, 3 vocabulary workbooks, and 1 very expensive set of audio lessons on a set of DVDs from a company that no longer existed. All of them sat on a shelf in her bedroom, arranged by size, most of them opened once and never again. She had studied English intermittently since she was 17. She was, according to any test, a strong intermediate speaker, but she could not, at 38, remember a single sentence she had studied 5 years earlier. She worked as a primary school teacher in the mid-sized city where she had grown up. She taught children between the ages of 6 and 8 in Urdu and simple English, mostly songs and letters and small stories about ducks. She loved the work, but every year she watched the older English literature teacher, an elegant woman named Miss Rahana, retire a little more visibly, and every year Lubna thought quietly that she would like to teach that class one day. The class that read poems by real poets, the class that discussed real ideas, the class where the children were 10 and 11 and hungry to be treated like they had minds. She had 2 of her own, a boy of 9 and a girl of 6. Her husband, a warm man who worked long hours as a hospital administrator, came home late and tired. By the time both children were asleep and the small dishes of the evening were washed, it was usually past 10, and Lubna had, at best, 30 minutes of usable mind left before her own eyes began to close. She had tried many times to use those 30 minutes for English. She had opened her grammar books. She had made vocabulary flashcards. She had sat at her small kitchen table trying to memorize the difference between the past perfect and the past perfect continuous while her mind slowly went dim. Everything she studied at 10 in the evening was gone by 10 the next evening. She had begun to believe, in the quiet way people believe things about themselves at 38, that her memory was simply not what it had been at 17. She had almost stopped trying. The turn began the way many small turns begin, by accident. She was scrolling on her phone one night after both children were finally asleep, looking for something warm and mindless to watch, when she came across a small, quiet video made by a woman with a soft voice who spoke about a subject Lubna had never heard discussed anywhere else. The video was about what her brain did at night while she slept, and what she could feed it in the small, warm minutes before she closed her eyes. Lubna sat up straighter on the edge of her bed. She had never in her life considered that her tiredness might not be the problem. The video suggested that her tiredness could actually be an ally, that the 15 small minutes before sleep, done warmly, were worth more than an hour of stress study in the middle of a busy afternoon. That her sleeping brain would do the work her exhausted evening brain could not. She watched the video twice. She watched it a third time the next night. On the 4th night she began. She started very small, because small was all she had. She kept a slow English podcast on her phone that she had once tried to listen to for a whole hour in the mornings, and had given up on because she never had the time. Now she sat on the edge of her bed at 10:15 every evening with a small cup of hot milk, and she listened to 10 minutes of the podcast. Not to memorize, not to test herself, only to let the sound of warm English wash gently over her tired mind, while she cupped the mug in both hands. At the end of the 10 minutes, she chose 2 or 3 sentences that had felt warm to her. Not the most complicated ones, not the ones with the most useful grammar. The ones that had, for reasons she could not have explained, touched something in her. She wrote them on a small piece of paper on her bedside table with a pen she kept there for the purpose. Then she turned off her phone and put it in the kitchen, in a small charging cradle her husband had bought her, and she came back to her bed. She lay down. She turned off her bedside lamp, and in the soft dark she whispered each sentence to herself 3 times, softly, in the same voice she used to say good night to her children after they had fallen asleep. She did not try to remember the sentences. She did not analyze them. She only said them gently and let them float. Then she closed her eyes and slept. Nothing happened for the first 10 nights. She woke up each morning, glanced at the paper on her bedside table, read the sentences once in the soft new light, and went to make her children's breakfast. The sentences felt ordinary. She could not tell if any of them were sinking into her at all. On the 11th night, she almost gave up. She sat on her bed with the paper in her hand and thought, "This is not working, and I am tired, and I am 38, and my brain is what it is." She kept going anyway, not because she believed, because giving up would have taken more energy than continuing. This is how many small good practices survive in the lives of tired women, not through inspiration, through the smaller cost of not stopping. On the 14th day, at 11 in the morning, standing in front of her class of 6-year-olds, while they copied letters into their small notebooks, a sentence arrived in her head unbidden. It was one she had whispered 5 nights earlier, about the way a poem describes a road as if the road were also a life. She had not thought about it since. It had come now, warmly and completely without her looking for it. She stood at the front of her classroom with a piece of chalk in her hand, and she felt something small and bright open in her chest. She had never in her adult life experienced her memory returning a sentence to her like a gift. She had spent 15 years working against her own mind. She had, without knowing it, just discovered how to work with it. The sentences began to arrive more often after that. Sometimes she would be at the market, choosing tomatoes, and a phrase from a podcast 3 nights earlier would drift up. Sometimes she would be lying in the small silence beside her husband, and a whole small paragraph would settle into her, warm and clear. She began to look forward to the 10 evening minutes the way she had once looked forward to a favorite drama. She had, without planning to, made a small, warm room inside her evenings, and she was quietly moving into it. On Sundays, when both children napped at the same time in the early afternoon, she made herself a cup of tea and gathered the small pieces of paper from the week. Sometimes there were 15 sentences, sometimes only 10 on weeks when she had missed a night. She read each one out loud softly in the warm Sunday light. The ones that felt automatic, that came out of her mouth without effort, she smiled at and set aside. The ones that still felt new, she copied onto a fresh piece of paper for the next week. This small ritual, done in the middle of her one quiet hour, was the piece she came to love most. It was proof on paper, in her own handwriting, that she was actually moving. She made small, honest adaptations to the routine because her life was not a clean laboratory. She could not play soft audio through the night the way the video had suggested, because her husband slept lightly and needed silence. She let that piece go without guilt. 4 parts of the routine, done warmly, were enough. She did not try to be perfect. She missed nights when the baby was sick or her mother-in-law came to stay, and she came back to the routine gently the following evening without punishing herself. The routine forgave her every time, and she began to forgive herself in the same warm shape. 90 nights passed. She counted them in a small line on the last page of her bedside notebook because she had promised herself she would. By the end of those 90 nights, she was a different English speaker than she had been in the summer. Not because she had learned a great many new grammar rules. She had learned very few. But because the English she already had, the English she had accumulated over 20 years of school and books and half-finished courses, had finally been pressed into her permanent memory. Her sentences came out of her more warmly. Her words arrived more quickly. She thought less in the space between hearing and replying. She began, quietly, to sound like a person who had lived inside English rather than a person who had been forever trying to visit it. At the end of the school year, Miss Rahana retired, and the head of the school called Lubna into her small office and asked if she would take the older English literature class the following year. Lubna said yes without hesitating. She began preparing the syllabus that summer, sitting on her small balcony in the evenings with a book of poems and her small notebook. She still did the 10-minute evening ritual. She had come to understand that it was not a project. It was a small habit that would live inside her life the way brushing her teeth did, quietly, forever, and it would keep quietly giving her back her own mind. 2 years later, a younger colleague, a woman of 26 who was starting to teach English and struggling with her own confidence, sat across from Lubna during a break and asked, in a small, tired voice, whether Lubna had any advice for someone who could not seem to remember anything she studied. Lubna thought for a long moment. She looked at the younger woman, who reminded her painfully of a version of herself. Yes, she said softly, do not try to study for an hour before you sleep. Study for 10 minutes. Choose 2 or 3 sentences that touch you. Whisper them softly in the dark. Read them again in the morning before you touch your phone. Gather them all on a warm Sunday afternoon. Trust the 90 nights. The younger woman frowned. 90 nights, she said, that is all. Lubna smiled the small smile of a woman who had learned everything the slow